The thing about the Kithaeron hegemony's most sacred war temple was that it had been designed by architects who clearly believed subtlety was a character flaw. Every surface crawled with carved depictions of glorious battle deaths. Every pillar was shaped like a spine extracted from some unfortunate enemy, and the ceiling featured a mosaic of skulls arranged in what the Kithaerons probably considered an uplifting pattern. Commander Reeves stood in the center of this monument to aggressive interior decorating and wondered if the trade negotiations would be as melodramatic as the venue suggested. "You stand in the presence of the war speakers of the 7 bleeding moons," announced High Executioner Thakmor, his 4 arms spread wide in what might have been a greeting or a threat assessment. The distinction seemed academic when each arm ended in retractable bone spikes. "Bow before the altar of eternal conquest, soft flesh, and perhaps your death will be swift." Reeves tilted her head, considering this. The Kithaerons were new to the galactic community, barely 3 decades since first contact, and their entire culture appeared to revolve around the philosophical question of who could kill whom most efficiently. Their ships looked like flying mausoleums, their cities resembled military cemeteries with better lighting, and their diplomats had apparently graduated from the same charm school as their executioners. "That's a lovely welcome," she said, pulling out her datapad. "Should I be taking notes? I'm not entirely sure if this is a greeting ritual or if you're actually threatening to murder a trade representative." The assembled war speakers made a sound like grinding metal, which, given their cybernetic throat modifications, might have been literally accurate. Thakmor's bone spikes extended another inch, which seemed to be the Kithaeron equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "You mock the sacred traditions of the hegemony?" "Not mocking, just trying to understand the protocol here. Are we doing the intimidation dance first, or can we skip straight to discussing rare earth mineral quotas? Because I've got a lunch meeting with the Centauran Commerce Guild, and their idea of intimidation involves spreadsheets." The silence that followed was the kind of dead air that suggested someone had fundamentally misunderstood the assignment. 6 war speakers flanked Reeves in what was clearly meant to be a classic encirclement maneuver, their ceremonial plasma blades humming to life with an electric whine that probably tested well in focus groups for menacing background noise. "Perhaps," Thakmor said slowly, "you do not comprehend your situation, human. You stand alone, surrounded by the finest warriors in the sector. Our blades could separate your head from your shoulders before your primitive reflexes could register the movement." Reeves looked around at the glowing weapons positioned precisely at throat level, each one held by a 7-foot-tall alien whose idea of casual wear included decorative bone fragments. The setup was admittedly professional. Good spacing, optimal angles, no obvious blind spots. Someone had clearly put thought into the choreography. "Huh," she said, and then did something that would later be analyzed by xenopsychologists across 17 star systems. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, or a diplomatic smile, but the kind of genuine amusement typically reserved for particularly clever jokes. "Is this supposed to be scary?" The question hung in the temple air like a theological challenge. Thakmor's primary eyes narrowed, while his secondary eyes performed what looked like a diagnostic reboot. "Scary." The word came out sounding like he was testing a foreign concept. "You face the certainty of death." "Do I, though?" Reeves shifted her weight, apparently unbothered by the fact that moving wrong would result in immediate decapitation. "Because this looks more like a performance. Very well rehearsed, don't get me wrong. The lighting is excellent, the positioning is textbook, and I appreciate the commitment to theme. But if you actually wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. So this is either the galaxy's most elaborate dinner theater, or you're trying to make a point about something." War Speaker Vorthak, whose ceremonial scars formed an intricate pattern across his skull plates, made a sound like a malfunctioning engine. She speaks of her death as if discussing weather patterns. The human's fear responses appear to be malfunctioning, observed War Speaker Clethen, her blade steady but her tone puzzled. Perhaps their species processes existential threats differently. Or maybe, Reeves suggested helpfully, you haven't actually presented an existential threat yet. Look, I appreciate the effort here, but I grew up in Detroit during the water wars. My grandmother used to tell bedtime stories about the time she held off 3 corporate raiders with a broken bottle and a really bad attitude. My uncle spent his weekends cave diving in flooded subway tunnels for fun. So, when you wave some glowing swords around and make spooky faces, my brain sort of goes, oh, that's nice, but what's the actual problem? The war speakers exchanged glances that somehow conveyed volumes of cultural confusion. Their entire governmental system was built on the premise that everyone shared their deep, abiding respect for violent death. Neighboring species had joined the hegemony specifically to avoid finding out what Kithaeron displeasure looked like in practice. But this human was treating their most sacred intimidation ritual like a mildly interesting museum exhibit. Your species has a death wish, Thakmor concluded, though he sounded less certain than before. Not really. We've got a life wish. Very strong one, actually. We're just not impressed by things that go whoosh and glow. You want to scare a human? Try student loan debt, or a root canal, or having to explain to your mother why you're still single at 35. Reeves checked her chronometer. Speaking of which, we've been at this intimidation thing for about 10 minutes now, and I'm starting to wonder if anyone's actually going to die, or if we can move on to the part where you tell me what you actually want. War Speaker Threkfol, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke. The human requests clarification of our intentions while surrounded by instruments of death. This behavior suggests either profound courage or complete insanity. Or option 3, Reeves said cheerfully. I'm a professional diplomat from a species that spent its entire evolutionary history being stalked by things with bigger teeth, sharper claws, and worse attitudes than anything in this room. You're going to have to try harder if you want to activate my fight-or-flight response. Maybe bring in some actual monsters next time? These ceremonial weapons are lovely, but they lack a certain je ne sais quoi. Where's the sense of immediate, unavoidable doom? The crushing weight of cosmic insignificance? The existential dread that comes from realizing you're completely at the mercy of forces beyond your comprehension or control? The temple fell silent, except for the low hum of plasma blades and the distant sound of Kithaeron worldviews undergoing rapid structural readjustment. Thakmor's bone spikes retracted slightly. What would you consider threatening, human? Reeves considered this seriously. Well, now that you mention it, I did get a message that my health insurance claim was under review. That's genuinely terrifying. Or there was this documentary about microplastics in drinking water. Kept me awake for days. Oh, and my nephew's starting to date, which is basically a horror movie waiting to happen. The war speakers lowered their blades in what appeared to be a collective admission of defeat, or possibly confusion so profound it had achieved its own gravitational field. We may, Thakmor said slowly, need to reconsider our approach to human relations. Probably a good idea, Reeves agreed. Now about those mineral rights. The emergency session convened in what the Galactic Behavioral Sciences Consortium generously called a conference room, though it looked more like the inside of a particularly neurotic brain. Holographic displays flickered with data streams, while representatives from 14 different species argued in 7 different languages about the fundamental nature of human psychology. Dr. Zieftal, of the Crystalline Archives, tapped her mineral fingers against the conference table, producing a sound like wind chimes having an anxiety attack. The recorded interaction defies every established model of threat response we have. No species, no rational species, treats mortal peril as a conversation starter. Rational being the operative term, interjected Professor Valdek from the Psi Collective. His three heads bobbed in disagreement with each other, which made following his arguments particularly challenging. Perhaps we're approaching this backwards. What if humans aren't broken? What if we simply don't understand their operational parameters? Military strategist Corvan of the Steel Hegemony slammed his mechanical fist on the table, causing several smaller species to scatter for cover. Parameters? The female was offered a clean warrior's death and responded with scheduling concerns. This isn't psychology, it's pathology. The holographic recording played again, zooming in on Commander Reeves's face at the moment of maximum threat saturation. Her expression registered somewhere between mild curiosity and the sort of polite attention usually reserved for moderately interesting weather patterns. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed no elevated stress indicators, no fight-or-flight preparation, no acknowledgement that she was approximately 3 seconds away from becoming a decorative spray pattern. "Look at the micro-expressions," urged Dr. Senthera, her compound eyes fracturing the image into thousands of analytical fragments. No pupil dilation, no involuntary muscle tension. Her cardiovascular system remained steady throughout the encounter. Either humans have evolved beyond basic survival instincts, or they're operating under a completely different definition of survival. Or, suggested economic advisor Nixtal, whose species had the unfortunate habit of stating uncomfortable truths, they're collectively insane, and we've been trying to establish trade relations with a species of functional psychopaths. The room erupted in what could charitably be called a heated academic discussion, though it sounded more like a riot in a philosophy department. The collective representatives argued in harmonic clusters, while the silicon-based life forms produced sounds like tectonic plates filing complaints. Through it all, the recording continued to loop, showing the same impossible moment of human calm in the face of overwhelming violence. "We have other data points," announced Chief Archivist Eulith, projecting a series of incident reports. The mining station collapse on Kepler 442b. Human rescue workers voluntarily descended into structurally compromised tunnels to extract survivors. Standard protocol would have been to wait for stabilization teams. "The Proxima Centauri transport disaster," added strategic analyst Quelper. "When the ship's reactor began cascading failure, human engineers stayed in the radiation zone to manually reroute power. They succeeded, but 2 died of exposure poisoning. The Battle of the Neutral Zone," Corvin said grimly. "Human pilots flew their fighters directly into the path of Mordak destroyer beams to buy evacuation time for civilian transports. They called it buying time. We called it suicide with better marketing." Professor Valdek's middle head looked thoughtful while his other 2 continued arguing with themselves. "Notice the pattern. Humans consistently choose increased personal risk in order to reduce risk for others. This suggests their survival calculations include variables we don't typically consider." "Such as?" Dr. Zieftal's crystalline structure flickered with curiosity. "Group survival over individual survival. Future outcomes over immediate safety. Abstract concepts like honor, duty, or legacy over concrete threats like death." Dr. Senthara's compound eyes refocused in what her species considered a gesture of profound disagreement. "That's not unique. Many species demonstrate pack loyalty or reproductive sacrifice, but humans extend this behavior to complete strangers, abstract principles, and sometimes just because they find the situation intellectually stimulating." The room went quiet, which in a gathering of this many species was roughly equivalent to achieving world peace. "Intellectually stimulating," repeated Nixtal slowly. "You're suggesting humans approach mortal danger as a problem-solving exercise." "I'm suggesting, Doctor," Senthara said carefully, that we've been trying to intimidate a species that treats intimidation as entertainment. Chief Archivist Euleth brought up another file. Human recreational activities. They climb mountains for no practical purpose. They jump from aircraft for enjoyment. They engage in combat sports as leisure activities. They voluntarily watch horror media to experience artificial fear responses. They seek out danger, Dr. Zieftal whispered, her crystal formation dimming in what her species considered horror. They actively pursue situations that trigger survival responses in other species. Not just seek out, corrected Corvin, his mechanical voice carrying an odd note of respect. They domesticate danger, convert it into manageable challenges. Their military training involves repeatedly exposing recruits to controlled versions of lethal situations until the fear response becomes secondary to tactical thinking. Military analyst Drexka had been silent throughout the discussion, but now her insectoid form clicked forward. We've been analyzing this incorrectly. The human's response at the Kithrin Temple wasn't fearlessness. It was professional assessment. She evaluated the threat level, determined it was below her operational threshold, and proceeded accordingly. Operational threshold? Professor Valdek's three heads turned toward each other in surprise. Consider her background data. Grew up in a conflict zone, family history of high-risk behavior, career in interstellar diplomacy. Her personal danger tolerance has been calibrated through decades of exposure. What terrifies us barely registers on her threat assessment scale. Economic advisor Nixtal pulled up comparative data. Human colony ships launched toward potentially hostile systems. 60% probability of encountering aggressive life forms, 30% chance of planetary hazards, 15% risk of complete mission failure. They call this acceptable odds. Because, Dr. Synthara said with dawning comprehension, they're not calculating risk the same way we are. We're asking, how can we avoid death? They're asking, what's the most interesting way to live? The recording played once more, but this time they watched with different eyes. Commander Reeves wasn't ignoring the danger. She was evaluating it, contextualizing it within a framework that treated risk as raw material for achievement rather than an obstacle to survival. So what does scare them? Asked Dr. Zieftal. The room fell silent again. In all their data, all their analysis, nobody had actually found the answer to that particular question. That, said Professor Valdek's primary head, while his other two nodded in agreement, is what we need to find out. Scholar Kethvana had always prided herself on methodical research, but 3 weeks into her investigation of human cultural artifacts, she was beginning to suspect that methodical research might be insufficient for understanding a species that appeared to have built their entire civilization around the concept of hold my drink and watch this. Her private study aboard the Kithrin research vessel looked like the aftermath of an explosion in a library. Holographic displays showed fragments of human literature, film, music, and historical records. Thousands of years of documentation that painted a picture so bizarre she kept rechecking the translation matrices to make sure she wasn't experiencing some sort of systematic error in linguistic interpretation. Personal log, day 22, she spoke into her recorder while staring at a collection of human myths projected before her. Subject species demonstrates consistent cultural fascination with voluntary confrontation of supernatural entities. They create fictional narratives specifically designed to terrorize themselves, then consume these narratives for entertainment purposes. She gestured at a sampling of human horror stories floating in the air around her. Tales of monsters, demons, cosmic entities, and various other things that any sensible species would avoid mentioning, let alone writing epic poems about. But humans didn't just acknowledge these terrors. They gave them names, wrote instruction manuals for defeating them, and turned the whole enterprise into a thriving entertainment industry. Archaeological evidence suggests early human settlements were deliberately established in locations with maximum predator density. Analysis of historical migration patterns indicates they consistently chose difficult terrain over safer alternatives. Contemporary human documents refer to this as the pioneer spirit, which appears to be a cultural euphemism for death wish with better publicity. Kethevana pulled up a timeline of human technological development. Every major advancement seemed to coincide with someone deciding that the current level of danger was insufficient and required upgrading. They split the atom, then immediately wondered what would happen if they split it bigger. They developed space travel, then began planning trips to planets that could kill them in creative new ways. They invented artificial intelligence, apparently just to see if they could create something smarter than themselves that might eventually decide they were obsolete. Religious documentation reveals systematic veneration of martyrdom across multiple belief systems. Humans not only accept death in service of abstract principles, they consider it the highest form of spiritual achievement. Their pantheons include war gods, death gods, and trickster deities, whose primary function appears to be making life more difficult in interesting ways. The really disturbing part wasn't just that humans worshipped dangerous gods. It was that their gods seemed to be just as reckless as they were. Human mythology was full of deities who picked fights with cosmic forces, made bets with fate, and generally behaved like divine teenagers with unlimited power and questionable judgment. She switched to human recreational activities, hoping for something more normal. The files that loaded made her question whether normal was a concept that applied to humans at all. Recreational pursuits include competitive danger exposure, voluntary psychological stress testing, and systematic desensitization to mortality. Popular activities: base jumping, horror entertainment, extreme sports, and something called escape rooms, where they pay to be locked in chambers and terrorized for fun. Kethevana paused her recording and leaned back in her chair, trying to process the implications. Humans had industrialized fear. They mass-produced terror, packaged it attractively, and sold it to each other as a form of leisure activity. Their entertainment industry had entire sectors devoted to creating increasingly sophisticated forms of artificial peril. Military history analysis reveals tactical preferences for asymmetric warfare, last stands, and what human sources term impossible victories. Notable pattern: when outnumbered or outgunned, humans do not retreat or surrender. Instead, they appear to become more creative. She brought up the Battle of Thermopylae, the Siege of Stalingrad, the defense of Rorke's Drift, instances where humans had looked at overwhelming odds and responded with what could only be described as aggressive optimism. They didn't just fight hopeless battles. They turned hopeless battles into legends, and then told those stories to their children as examples of proper behavior. Cultural analysis of human parenting reveals systematic exposure of offspring to graduated danger scenarios. They call this building character. Children are encouraged to climb trees, explore unknown environments, and engage in competitive physical challenges. Safety equipment is provided, but accompanied by explicit expectations that it will be needed. The education files were particularly revealing. Human schools didn't just teach knowledge, they taught resilience, problem-solving under pressure, and something called critical thinking, which appeared to involve questioning authority figures and established systems. They actually trained their young to be suspicious of simple answers and comfortable with uncertainty. Economic structures demonstrate institutionalized risk tolerance. Stock markets, venture capital, entrepreneurship, entire sectors devoted to voluntary uncertainty. Humans not only accept that their economic decisions might fail catastrophically, they've built sophisticated systems to manage and distribute that failure across multiple participants. Kethevana pulled up records of human explorers and immediately regretted it. Every continent had been mapped by people who decided to walk into unknown territory just to see what was there. Every ocean had been crossed by individuals who looked at vast expanses of potentially lethal water and thought, I bet I could get to the other side of that. They had climbed the highest mountains, descended into the deepest caves, and ventured into environments that could kill them in seconds. Not because they had to, but because they were curious. Scientific methodology appears to be institutionalized danger-seeking behavior. Hypothesis testing involves deliberately creating conditions that could prove their assumptions wrong. They actively seek information that contradicts their beliefs, consider failed experiments valuable data, and maintain that uncertainty is preferable to comfortable ignorance. She stared at the accumulated evidence floating around her study. Humans didn't just tolerate risk. They had built their entire civilization around the systematic conversion of danger into opportunity. Fear wasn't something they overcame. It was something they harvested as raw material for progress. Final observation, she recorded slowly. The question is not what humans find threatening. The question is whether they find anything threatening enough to stop them from investigating it further. Her communication system chimed with an incoming priority message from the Galactic Consortium. Another incident report. This time, a human research team had received warnings that their proposed expedition into the Null Zone would result in certain death from exotic radiation exposure. Their response had been to request additional funding for better equipment. Kethevana closed the file and began composing her report. Somewhere in human space, Commander Reeves was probably negotiating another trade agreement, cheerfully unaware that she had triggered the largest xenopsychological investigation in galactic history. The real question wasn't why humans weren't afraid of the things that terrified everyone else. The real question was what could possibly scare a species that treated the unknown as an invitation rather than a warning. Commander Reeves sat in what the Galactic Consortium had optimistically labeled a neutral meeting space, though it looked more like the inside of a diplomatic panic room. Representatives from 43 species had arranged themselves in a careful hierarchy of mutual distrust, all of them staring at her with the sort of intense focus usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. "Let me see if I understand the situation correctly," she said, scrolling through the formal inquiry on her tablet. "You've spent the last month conducting emergency psychological evaluations because I didn't wet myself when some aliens waved glowing sticks at me." Ambassador Thyril Knox of the Convergence spoke first, his translator struggling with what appeared to be a combination of exasperation and genuine scientific curiosity. "Your species' psychological profile defies every predictive model we possess. We need to understand how humans process existential threats." Existential threats? Reeves looked around the assembly, noting the careful positioning of security forces and the subtle energy shields that had been erected around her chair. "Are we talking about the same thing here? Because what happened at the Kithrin Temple wasn't an existential threat. It was a cultural misunderstanding with props." High Scholar Velth An leaned forward, her bioluminescent patches flickering in what her species considered an expression of intense concentration. "You were surrounded by weapons capable of instantaneous termination. Your survival probability was effectively 0. "My survival probability," Reeves corrected gently, "was whatever I decided it was going to be." That's how human psychology works. We don't just react to threats. We evaluate them, categorize them, and then decide what level of concern they deserve. The assembled delegates exchanged the sort of looks typically shared by people watching someone explain why they enjoyed juggling live grenades. "Explain this evaluation process," requested Prime Analyst Korveth, his mechanical voice carrying undertones of what might have been professional desperation. Reeves set down her tablet and considered how to explain several million years of evolutionary psychology to an audience that apparently thought survival was a binary function. Humans evolved in an environment where everything was trying to kill us. Predators, weather, disease, other humans, the occasional geological catastrophe. Death was basically our planet's primary export. But here's the thing. We didn't evolve to be fearless. We evolved to be practical. She stood up, ignoring the way every security system in the room suddenly focused on her movement patterns. Fear is information. Pain is data. Danger is a problem that needs solving. When you surrounded me with your ceremonial weapons, my brain didn't go, "Oh no, I'm about to die." It went, "Interesting. What are they actually trying to accomplish here?" Because humans learned a long time ago that the things trying to kill you are usually less dangerous than the things you don't understand. Fleet Commander Nextall, whose species had developed interstellar travel specifically to get away from things that might hurt them, made a sound like metal grinding against stone. You treat mortal peril as a puzzle. We treat everything as a puzzle. That's what intelligence is for. You see a locked door, you figure out how to open it. You see a mountain, you figure out how to climb it. You see a problem that could kill you, you figure out how to solve it without dying. The only difference is stakes. Regional Director Feldara spoke up, her voice carrying the sort of careful neutrality that suggested she was translating concepts her species didn't have words for. But what about situations where no solution exists? What about inevitable death? Reeves smiled, and several delegates flinched at the expression. There's no such thing as inevitable death. There's just death you haven't figured out how to postpone yet. Humans have been postponing death for millennia. Medicine, technology, social cooperation, pure bloody-minded stubbornness. We've gotten pretty good at it. But you do experience fear, pressed Dr. Zenthenak, his research credentials apparently including a specialization in impossible psychological profiles. Our data indicates humans have phobic responses to various stimuli. Oh, absolutely. We're terrified of all sorts of things. Reeves settled back into her chair, apparently unaware that admitting to fear in a room full of predatory species was generally considered poor diplomatic strategy. We're afraid of social rejection, economic instability, our children being hurt, making the wrong choices, being forgotten, not living up to our potential, running out of time to do the things that matter to us. The room went silent in a way that suggested everyone was rapidly recalculating their understanding of human psychology. You fear abstract concepts, said Ambassador Thyril Knox slowly. We fear meaningful concepts. Death is just a thing that happens. It's not personal, it's not meaningful, it's just physics. But failing to protect someone who trusted us? Making a decision that ruins someone else's life? Being remembered as someone who didn't try hard enough when it mattered? Those are the things that keep humans awake at night. Chief strategist Murextel, whose species had built their entire civilization around avoiding uncomfortable situations, leaned forward. You're saying humans don't fear personal termination. I'm saying humans fear personal insignificance. Death is just one possible form of failure, and it's not even the worst one. We're much more afraid of living badly than dying well. The silence that followed was profound enough to have its own gravitational field. So when you were surrounded by warriors threatening your life, High Scholar Velthon said carefully, you evaluated the threat level based not on your potential death, but on whether that death would be meaningfully significant? I evaluated the threat level based on whether they actually intended to kill me, whether I had any control over the situation, and whether dying there would accomplish anything useful. The answers were no, yes, and definitely not, so I proceeded accordingly. Ambassador Thyril Knox made a sound like a computer trying to process a logical paradox. Your species has developed immunity to existential terror. Our species developed better existential priorities. You can't terrorize someone who's more afraid of wasting their life than losing it. Economic Advisor Quileth had been silent throughout the exchange, but now spoke with the sort of careful precision that suggested she was testing a theory. What would constitute an effective threat against humans? Reeves considered this seriously. Bureaucracy. Meaningless rules enforced by people who've forgotten why the rules exist. Being forced to fill out forms in triplicate for permission to help someone. Watching preventable suffering continue because someone doesn't want to take responsibility for making a decision. Red tape, basically. Pure, mind-numbing administrative inefficiency. The assembled delegates stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. "You fear," said Fleet Commander Nextall with something approaching awe. "Administrative procedures? We fear systems designed to prevent action, responsibility, and meaningful change. We fear being trapped in cycles of pointless process while important problems go unsolved. We fear," Reeves concluded with a slight shiver, "committee meetings that could have been emails." The Galactic Consortium representatives looked around at each other, then at the elaborate bureaucratic structure they had spent centuries constructing to manage interspecies relations through careful procedural safeguards and risk-averse administrative protocols. For the first time in the meeting, Commander Reeves looked genuinely sympathetic. "Oh," she said gently, "I think I see the problem now.